Hello, this is Melissa Molinix, the nurse educator for Northwest Ohio Psychiatric Hospital. And today we're going to go over safety. We're going to have a safety review. Today we're going to talk about least restrictive environments. We're going to talk about one-to-one observation safety. We're going to talk about high-risk suicide precautions. We're going to talk about our new remodeled units, their milieu safety as part of a least restrictive environment. And we're going to talk about milieu management. So first, let's talk about least restrictive environments. So in society, we walk about and we can pretty much do the things that we need to do in our lives. But when we become a threat to ourselves or others, then we find ourselves in places like jail or prison or in the state psychiatric hospital. So in our hospital, we have various levels of security that we can enable our patients to be in the least restrictive environment. Our most restrictive environment are leather restraints, and sometimes this is the least restrictive environment for someone, especially when they're actively trying to hurt themselves or others. This is followed by our least restrictive environment from that would be our seclusion room, either locked or unlocked, and then a one-to-one or two-to-one observation, or a 5-minute check, or a 15-minute special observation. And our standard observations are our least restrictive environment here at NOPH. So one-to-one for patient in crisis. So staff are assigned to only care for that patient. They're not to care for any other patients. So that means if you're sitting on a patient and you're in the laundry room and there's other patients that want you to help them with their laundry, you cannot do it because you cannot turn your back on the patient that you're sitting on for your one-to-one. And you want to always maintain view of your patients. So unless an order states otherwise, we're to be 4 feet away from our patients. That's a max distance of 4 feet. Now, some orders may say that you may be a line of sight away from your patient, or that you may be 10 feet or an arm's length away from your patient. But if they don't list this specifically, then we're to only be 4 feet away from our patient. And to kind of gauge what 4 feet away from our patient is, it's about 3 small steps away from our patient. We want to always maintain the view of our patients, including during toileting and showering. But we don't have to stare directly at our patients. We can keep them safe by looking and keeping them in our periphery while they're toileting or when they're showering. But whenever possible, we want to make sure that we can have somebody of the same gender assigned to observe when they're in the bathrooms. Now, if that's not possible, then what we'll want to do is we'll want to vocera or call another staff member of either gender to come down and watch. But we prefer it's the same gender as the patient. And part of this is because, you know, I'm sure many of us have experienced this, but sometimes patients can make allegations that you've done something or said something that you didn't do. And when you have a witness there, that will help prevent a lot of that. So having somebody there is helpful. Now, you know, you can't just sit on a one-to-one and then when a patient gets up and says that they have to go pee, say, oh, hold on a second, I got to get somebody. What you should do is when you're going to sit on them as a one-to-one, let them know that it's part of our policy that we would have somebody else come up when they're going to the bathroom or when they're showering. So that way they can warn you when they have to go to the bathroom, and you know that they could say, hey, you know, I'm gonna need to go to the bathroom here in a minute. Would you mind, you know, calling for somebody because I'll be ready to go. And you know, if you talk to a patient and let them know that this is the situation, that this is what we do, usually they're a little bit then they're not surprised and agitated by it when you do have to have them wait to call somebody up. So whenever possible, like I said, staff of the same gender, but when we can't, we'll just get somebody of the same gender, but we need to have a witness. And we need to always maintain view of patients, including in the dining room. So in our dining rooms, we have our patients are becoming more forensic, more prison, jail mentality. And even though we might have this patient on finger foods out of precaution, they still find a way to get pocketing plasticware. And even when they don't even have pockets, you don't know how they did it. They kind of Houdini it. But we want to watch and make sure they're not swiping those things off of other people's trays or off of, the garbage. Under the sheets, we need to watch for self-harm under the sheets and under the blankets. I had a patient at one time that had abdominal sutures, and under the sheets they had picked apart their abdominal sutures, and we had to send them to UTMC because they were bleeding all over the place. They had picked that incision open. So when we are caring for patients that are especially borderline patients, we need to watch for that, for them picking, for them scratching, especially if they have longer fingernails, because then they can do some significant damage to themselves, especially under the sheets. But also they could be fashioning something, a weapon or something that they have, from something they found somewhere. So we want to just be cautious. And if you suspect anything, have them have their arms outside of the sheet. So when you did your suicide mandate this year, you learned that all people with mental illness are at an elevated risk for suicide. Here at NOPH, we need to assume that all of our patients are at an elevated risk for suicide, but we also have a high risk clientele. So we have patients that here, even for here, are at a higher risk of committing suicide. And our high risk suicidal patients, that's what we're going to focus on next in this program. Policy 2.10 is our policy that talks about the different risk levels for our suicidal patients. So high risk suicidal patients, they're to be on a mandatory special observation. At minimum, that's a 1-to-1 or a Q5-minute check. And if you were wondering where the 5-minute observation policy is, it's in policy 2.10. And this patient is to be evaluated daily by a physician. That includes weekends and holidays. The patient is placed in the comfort suite if possible. But with our newer remodeled rooms, all of those newer remodeled rooms are like comfort suite rooms. So we want to make sure that we're putting our patient as close to the nurse's station as possible. That way, if something happens with a patient or staff, other staff can quickly respond. And we want to provide them with suicide deterrent furnishings, such as the safety suit, which is that heavier green suit that we have, or a safety blanket, which is our heavy blanket that can't be shredded. And then we also want to do daily environmental room checks on that room. So what kind of things would we find in a room with a patient who actively wants to kill themselves? Well, we might find shredded or knotted sheets, shredded or knotted clothing. We might find strings. And look out for strings that maybe perhaps accidentally made it past the admitting checks, such as strings that are inside the waistband of sweatpants that a patient brings in, because the strings can suck up inside that waistband, or inside the tract of the neck for a hoodie. We want to also look in their environment for ceiling or cabinet fixtures that are broken or out of sorts. And then we also want to do a Columbia Suicide Scale on them every shift. And then let's talk about now a remodeled unit milieu safety as part of a least restrictive environment. So what does the literature actually say about milieu management? So when I do a education, I look and see what does our policy say, what do the other RPH policies say, or regional psychiatric hospitals, and then what does the literature say? And it's no surprise to most of us that when we have an increased presence of staff in the milieu, it reduces the instances of violence. It reduces the needs for emergency medications. It reduces the needs for seclusion. It reduces the needs for restraints. And there's a huge body of evidence that shows this. And it's easy to find a peer-reviewed article on this online. So different units have different physical structures right now. You know, we have our units right now, 300 and 100 that still look the old classical way. And then we have 200 that's been remodeled. We have 400 that's getting remodeled right now. We have 600 that's this new sort of way. And then we have 500 that's kind of doing its own thing. So we want to make sure that we adjust our milieu safety to the environment we work in. And how we want to do milieu management is we want to have one staff assigned rounds boards and safety checks at a time. So we need to take turns with staff for 1 to 2 hour increments. And the charge nurse should note that on the assignment sheet. So everybody knows when they're to take those rounds boards and safety checks. And everybody should be taking a turn doing this. Not just TPWs, but also LPNs and RNs. One staff needs to be in the area where they can observe staff and patients at all times. And that this is very key. We need to make sure that our people that are doing the rounds and our people that are observing in the milieu are safe. And we need to make sure our patients are safe. So having somebody behind the nurse's station, keeping an eye out on the milieu is just absolutely key. It's absolutely key. And then we need to have somebody who is a milieu circulator. And the milieu circulator, they need to stay in the milieu area, and they need to keep a watch of patients and staff, and making sure everybody's safe. And so their only job is to watch and interact with patients in the milieu. They're not to have any other duties and any other responsibilities. The fact is our patients are becoming more forensic. And our forensic patients have what they call, or it's commonly referred to as jail or prison mentality. And they might distract staff by asking them to make a phone call or asking them to do this or asking them to do that. And as soon as their back is turned, then they start doing mischievous things. So we want to make sure that we have staff that are keeping an eye on that. Somebody whose only job is to go out in the milieu and watch for these things, to watch out for suspicious activity, to be on the lookout for patients who are becoming agitated, and to monitor fixtures in the milieu and make sure they're untampered. Fixtures such as ceiling panels, the garbage can, various other fixtures in the patient care area, and to ensure that patients aren't hoarding items from the dinner trays, like we talked about earlier, such as plasticware. And to look out for other environmental hazards, such as spilled milk or spilled water. I know that our patients, you know, if they fall, they could get hurt, and we would have to do the process of a falls report. Or if staff should fall and get hurt. Some of our staff can't take a fall. So these are things that we need to look at. And that's why it's important to have somebody monitoring the milieu at all times. And the charge nurse will assign staff to the circulator position and the desk rounds position, rotating every 1 to 2 hours or as needed. It's important that we try to keep these positions as much as possible. And I understand with staff fluctuations, it's not always that easy. When we have treatment teams, when we have lunches, when we have court, and when people are pulled off for screening, or for other reasons, it makes it difficult to implement ideal milieu management. If I can drive one point home, it's that we need to be as out in the milieu as much as possible, And we need to have somebody having a constant eye on the milieu. Because again, our patients are only becoming more violent. They're only becoming more forensic. And certain patients, if they can pull something, they will. And it's important that we do this so that way all of us can clock out and go home at the end of our shift. This is the end of the presentation. And if you have any questions, please contact your nursing supervisor, or you're welcome to call me or email me. I hope you all have a nice rest of your shift, and I will talk to you later.